We'll say one thing before we start. I'll ask, we're conscious that lots of people are on their lunch break and that, so we want to be tied up, we want to be get through it in an hour or as near as possible to an hour. So I will be quite ruthless in terms of time with people. So when you hear me banging with a pen on a glass or something, that's time. That's a signal to the speakers to finish up. Just briefly before we move to the politicians, we have a couple of contributions from the organisers of the event. Firstly, from John Devitt from Transparency International.
Thank you, Pat. And on behalf of Transparency International Ireland, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to thank our panellists, political representatives, our representatives on, or spokespersons on political reform from the parties, as well as Pat Leahy from the Sunday Business Post. Very grateful, Pat. Before I hand back over to Pat, I should just say that Transparency International, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is an organisation similar to Amnesty International, where Amnesty International combat the abuse of human rights, Transparency International combats the abuse of power. We've been highlighting the risk of both legal and illegal corruption in Ireland since 2005, and in 2009 we published this study. I hope you all have a free copy. There are copies outside the door, making some 40 recommendations on how to clean up both government and business. The study was ironically supported by the Department of Justice and by the government. Not one of the recommendations we made in 2009 was implemented. I think it's extraordinary that political reform and open government has climbed up the political agenda in the way it has during this election. But I think it would be a missed opportunity if we simply introduced some very, should I say, some headline-grabbing reforms without dealing with the detail. There's a great deal of work to be done, and political reform involves a lot more than just abolishing the Seanad. And I'd urge you to look at this study, examine the recommendations, and consider them when you go to vote on Friday. With that, I'll leave you back over to Pat. Thanks very much for coming along again, and I look forward to talking to you anon. Take care.
Okay, we have two more short contributions before we come to the politicians. Firstly, from Joe Curtin, one of the founders of Political Reform.
That's a very lofty title, founder of Political Reform, founder of ReformCard, co-founder with Johnny Ryan of ReformCard.com. We're going to play you a very short video just to explain the project far more succinctly than I ever could. So without rehashing the same territory, I just wanted to briefly make some headline points about ReformCard.com and what we're trying to achieve. So the first thing we want to do is we want to bring clarity to a debate which we consider to be quite fractious and often, maybe characterized by more bluff and bluster, more heat than light. The second thing we wanted to do, and this has become more and more important to us as the political debate has continued, is we want to make sure that there's a focus across a broad area of reform and that the political system isn't fixated on one area of reform. There is no panacea for political reform and there is no cure-all. We need to identify, we need to ensure that there's a broad reform agenda which considers the 5 areas that we have pointed out on this slide. And I think that from our initial scoring of the political parties, what we've noticed is that each political party, each set of proposals have their strengths. And if you actually put all of the parties' proposals together, we would have a really strong political reform package. So what I'd like to maybe say to the politicians or political representatives today is that I think that this is a challenge that goes beyond point scoring, it goes beyond politics. There's a unique challenge now and a unique opportunity to tackle the political reform agenda, and I think that the political parties can learn from each other and address this challenge in a sort of collegial spirit. And so I think that it's, for example, in our initial preliminary scoring, each of the political parties had its area where it was particularly strong. Fianna Fáil on Oireachtas reform, the Green Party on local government. We had Sinn Féin on electoral reform. We had Fine Gael were very strong on public sector reform and open government. And on public sector reform, again, Labour were very strong. But nobody stood out, even though there was one party which headed the ratings, no party stood out in all of those areas. So I think that that's something we would like to see the programme for government getting a higher rating than any of the individual parties. But I'd like to now invite Dr. Jane Souter from the academic panel, and she's going to present our revised scoring because our scorings have been upgraded further to the publication of some new documentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so after we did the initial scoring last Wednesday, Fine Gael put out a slightly more detailed version of their political reform plan. The Greens put out a new document, as did Sinn Féin. So we rescored all of the parties. So I'm just literally in about 1 minute just going to take you through the new scores. So Sinn Féin have almost doubled their score up to 51%. And in that, they've got an awful lot more proposals on electoral reform. They're very strong on immigrants voting, on bringing in more young people, on women in the political system, and also a little bit on Oireachtas reform, on committees and so on. Fianna Fáil are still the same. They haven't had a document. I think Avril would tell you, I think their local government one might come out tomorrow or the day after. If that's the case, you can see that local government is where they're particularly weak, which has been dragging them down. The Green Party have jumped a good deal with their new proposals, up to 68%. And the Greens are particularly strong on open government, on FOI, and on lobbyists and party funding reform and that kind of thing. Labour are still on 68% because they had all of their documentation out beforehand. And again, Labour are strong on open government, but also on reforming the public sector, an area that the Greens and Sinn Féin are both relatively weaker on. And finally, Fine Gael are on 74, which is very slightly higher than before, and that's because they had more. Most of it is because they had more proposals on involving citizens in local democracy to a greater extent. So I'll hand you back to Pat now.